You'll want a lawyer.
On a grey Tuesday morning, Maggie Doyle stood on the sidewalk in front of the house she grew up in, watching a locksmith drill through a lock she'd had a key to 20 minutes earlier. Boxes of her father's things sat in the wet grass beside her suitcase. Her stepmother watched from the porch, arms crossed, already rehearsing how she'd describe this moment to her friends later. Maggie didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at the woman who had just changed the locks on her father's house 9 days after his funeral and said 4 words that would end up meaning far more than either of them understood in that instant. You'll want a lawyer.
You'll want a lawyer.
Then she picked up her suitcase and walked away, and for the next several weeks, she let everyone believe she'd lost everything. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't leave just yet. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments section, because what happens next changes everything. And if you love emotional stories filled with betrayal, secrets, and unexpected twists, make sure you subscribe to StoryMind and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next story. Now, let's get back to it. To understand how a 54-year-old woman could be thrown out of her own childhood home without raising her voice, you have to go back further than that Tuesday morning. You have to understand what her father did in total secrecy in his final year, what Maggie had already known for months before that porch scene happened, and why the woman standing there, so certain of her victory, had no idea she was about to lose everything she'd already spent. Was Maggie really as powerless as she looked? What had she been quietly waiting for? And what would it cost her stepmother to find out the answer the hard way? Desmond Doyle spent 30 years as a contractor, and the house on Ridgemont Lane wasn't just where his family lived. He built half of it with his own hands, weekend by weekend, while a young Maggie sat on an overturned bucket handing him nails. After Maggie's mother died when Maggie was in her 20s, Desmond told his daughter that no matter what else changed in his life, that house would always be hers. It wasn't sentiment, it was a promise, made in the kind of plain, steady voice that men like Desmond only used when they meant something completely. The house held 100 small proofs of that promise, but the one Maggie carried longest was the porch swing. Desmond built it the summer she turned 12, out of leftover cedar from a job he'd finished early, hanging it from the same beam he'd later used to frame the roofline addition. He told her, swinging beside her that first evening, as the sun went down over Ridgemont Lane, that a house wasn't really about the walls. It was about who you built it for. Maggie didn't understand what he meant, until she was much older. By then, the swing had been replaced twice, and the promise behind it had outlasted both swings, and eventually outlasted him. Diane came into the picture 4 years later, warm and attentive at first, the kind of woman who brought casseroles to the funeral and stayed long after the other guests left. Desmond, lonely and grieving, mistook her attentiveness for devotion. Maggie watched the marriage unfold from a careful distance, never quite trusting the timing of it, never quite able to prove why. Diane's son Trevor moved in within the year, and the house that had once felt like Maggie's began to feel, slowly and deliberately, like she was the guest in it. The first sign came quietly, within months of the wedding. Maggie's mother's photographs, which had lined the hallway for as long as Maggie could remember, disappeared one week while Maggie was away on a work trip. Diane explained it as decluttering, said the frames had gone into storage to protect them, and filled the wall with a gallery of her own family instead. Desmond noticed the change and said nothing, the same way he would say nothing for years afterward. Not because he didn't see it, but because peace, to him, always felt more urgent than confrontation. For nearly 2 decades, Maggie absorbed 1,000 small erasures, family photos rearranged so hers ended up in drawers. Holidays quietly restructured around Diane's side of the family. Maggie kept showing up anyway, kept helping her father with his taxes and his doctor's appointments, kept being the daughter, even as Diane made it clear, in ways too subtle to ever confront directly, that Maggie's place in that house was provisional. Desmond noticed more than anyone realized. He simply chose, for years, to keep the peace instead of naming what he saw. One Thanksgiving stood out more than the others, mostly because of how ordinary it was. Diane had reorganized the seating chart, so her side of the family filled the main table, while Maggie was quietly placed at a folding table near the kitchen. Just for the overflow, even though there was no overflow that year, Desmond noticed. He pulled a chair over and sat beside his daughter at the folding table, instead of correcting the arrangement. A small gesture that said everything he wouldn't say out loud. Maggie appreciated it and resented it in equal measure. Grateful for the company. Tired of a life where dignity had to be quietly rescued instead of simply given. Trevor's financial troubles didn't start with a truck deposit. Years earlier, he'd sunk what savings he had into a food truck venture that failed within 18 months, then a cryptocurrency scheme that failed faster, each time returning to his mother for a loan he called temporary. Diane always found the money somewhere, usually without telling Desmond the full amount, and Trevor learned early that consequences in that house were negotiable if you asked the right person. It was a lesson he would lean on again, years later, when a much larger sum felt within reach. That changed the year Desmond's heart began to fail. As his health declined, so did his patience for pretending. He started asking Maggie quiet questions about her finances, her plans, whether she'd ever want to live in the house again someday. He started taking phone calls in his study with the door closed. Calls to Robert Chen, the attorney who'd handled his contracting business for 20 years, and, more importantly, had been Desmond's friend since before Diane existed. Once, carrying in a cup of tea, Maggie caught a single fragment through the door before she could stop herself. Her father's voice, lower than usual, saying, "Just make sure she can't touch it, no matter what happens to me." She stood in the hallway a moment too long, then kept walking, telling herself it wasn't her business yet. Maggie noticed the calls. She didn't ask what they were about. She had learned, a long time ago, not to ask her father questions he wasn't ready to answer. What she did notice was the drawer, a locked drawer in Desmond's study, one she'd never seen opened in her life, one Diane had tried and failed to pry open more than once, while pretending to look for tax documents. Maggie asked her father about it exactly once. He told her, with a faint smile she didn't understand at the time, that everything in that drawer would make sense eventually, and that she shouldn't worry about it until it did. 6 months later, Desmond was gone, and the drawer was still locked. What Maggie didn't tell anyone, not Diane, not Trevor, not a single friend who offered condolences at the funeral, was that Robert Chen had called her 2 days after the burial and asked her to come to his office alone. What he told her that afternoon rewrote everything she thought she understood about her father's final year, and what she decided to do with that information in the 9 days that followed was the real reason she walked away from that porch without a fight. Diane's transformation began the morning after the funeral. The grieving widow who'd sobbed through the eulogy was by breakfast already on the phone with a realtor, describing the house in the confident, proprietary tone of a woman discussing an asset she'd already spent in her head. Trevor arrived within the week carrying a folder of listing comparisons, talking about square footage and closing timelines like the ink on the death certificate hadn't dried. Neither of them mentioned Maggie in these conversations. As far as they were concerned, she was a formality, a grown daughter who'd get some sentimental keepsakes and be on her way. The eviction came fast and dressed up as practicality. Diane told Maggie the estate needed to be settled cleanly, that clutter from before would hurt the sale price, that it would be easier for everyone if Maggie cleared out her father's study within 48 hours. Maggie didn't argue the timeline. She didn't mention the drawer, or Robert Chen, or the meeting 2 days after the funeral that Diane knew nothing about. She simply packed, box by box, while Diane hovered nearby, narrating which items were worth keeping. A woman inventorying a house, she believed, with total conviction, was already hers. On the final day, Diane changed the locks before Maggie had even finished loading her car. A small cruelty, dressed up as efficiency. When Maggie came back for one last box, she found herself locked out of the home her father built, with his own hands, standing on a porch that no longer recognized her key. It would have been easy to scream. It would have been justified. Instead, Maggie stood there for a long moment, looking at Diane's satisfied expression, and felt something close to pity, because Diane had no idea she was celebrating a victory that had already expired 8 months earlier. That night, alone in a rented apartment surrounded by boxes labeled in her father's handwriting, Maggie could have called Robert Chen and ended the entire charade with one phone call. She didn't. She sat with the truth Robert had told her at that office meeting, turned it over in her mind, and made a decision that surprised even her. She would let Diane and Trevor believe they'd won, for as long as they wanted to believe it. Every dollar they spent against a house that wasn't theirs, every plan they built on a foundation that had already been quietly removed, would only make the eventual reckoning sharper. Weeks passed, and Diane's confidence only grew. Priya staged the house with rented furniture, scheduled a weekend open house, and told Diane privately that a bidding war was likely given the neighborhood's recent sales. Diane began mentally spending the proceeds before a single offer arrived: a smaller condo for herself, a cushion to quietly cover the loan she'd taken out for the renovations, enough left over to finally stop worrying about money the way she'd worried for years. She told her sister the sale was basically done. She told Trevor the same thing, twice, because he kept asking. The first open house never happened. 3 days before it was scheduled, Priya's office ran the standard pre-listing title search, a routine step, the kind that usually takes an afternoon and confirms what everyone already assumes. Instead, the escrow officer flagged a discrepancy. The deed on file with the county recorder didn't list Desmond as sole owner at the time of his death. It listed a trust. Priya, assuming a clerical mix-up from some decades-old refinancing, asked the county for clarification and got back a filing date that didn't match anything in Diane's paperwork, 8 months before Desmond died. Diane's first instinct wasn't fear, it was irritation, the kind reserved for bureaucratic incompetence. She called the county recorder's office herself, sat on hold for 40 minutes, and was told, flatly, that the filing was correctly recorded and not the result of an error. She hung up and called back the next day, convinced she'd simply spoken to someone unhelpful. She got the same answer from a different clerk. For a few days, Diane floated a theory to Priya that Desmond's ex-business partner from decades earlier might have some old, forgotten claim tangled up in the paperwork. Anything that let her avoid the more obvious explanation sitting in front of her. Trevor had his own pressures mounting in parallel, and they left him far less patient than his mother. The truck dealership called twice about his deposit, hinting that financing was contingent on proof of incoming funds. A creditor from his failed business venture began calling daily, no longer accepting vague reassurances about a house sale any week now. Trevor, cornered, told the creditor the closing was imminent, a lie he needed to become true faster than the paperwork was cooperating. He started pushing Diane to move faster, then to hire someone who could actually get answers, unwilling to accept that the delay might not be fixable by pushing harder. Diane hired a paralegal named Sandra Whitfield to dig through the county records properly, certain a professional would find the error the clerks had missed. Sandra didn't find an error. She found a fully executed trust agreement, notarized and filed correctly, naming a beneficiary Sandra wasn't authorized to disclose without a court order. But the filing date alone told Diane everything she didn't want to know. 8 months before Desmond's death, long before his diagnosis worsened, long before anyone could argue, credibly, that he hadn't understood what he was signing. That was the moment Diane's irritation became something closer to panic. And panic, in Diane, had always looked like blame aimed outward rather than in. She fixated immediately on Robert Chen, the one person outside the family who'd had Desmond's trust for decades, the one person who'd been quietly present for calls Diane was never invited to join. She drove to his office without an appointment, sat across from him, and accused him outright of manipulating a dying man out of his own estate threatening to report him to the state bar and sue for undue influence before she'd even asked him a single real question. Robert let her finish. He didn't confirm the trust's contents, didn't mention Maggie's name, didn't give Diane anything she could repeat later as an admission. He simply told her, calmly, that Desmond had been entirely lucid when the documents were signed, that the filing had followed every legal requirement, and that if Diane wanted to challenge it, she was welcome to retain counsel and do so formally. It was the kind of answer that gave her nothing to grab onto and everything to be afraid of, and she left his office angrier than when she'd arrived. Trevor picked up the theory his mother couldn't fully articulate and ran further with it, telling cousins and family friends at a birthday gathering that the lawyer had clearly taken advantage of a sick old man, that something needed to be done before it was too late to fix. The story spread through the family the way convenient stories do, repeated more for how satisfying it felt than for how well it held up. Nobody asked Trevor why he was so certain. Nobody asked why his certainty had appeared only after his own deposit money was at risk. While Diane built her case against a man who'd done nothing wrong, Maggie was 3 miles away, doing something far less dramatic and far more dangerous to Diane's position, quietly organizing years of her father's bank statements into a single, chronological file. She'd kept boxes of Desmond's old paperwork since helping him with his taxes years earlier, and now, with time and motive she hadn't had before, she went through every page. What she found wasn't one suspicious withdrawal. It was a pattern, recurring, deliberate, and dated with uncomfortable precision to the periods when Desmond's memory had been at its weakest. She brought the file to Robert Chen, not as an accusation yet, just as a question. Did any of this look normal to him? Robert, who had handled Desmond's affairs for 20 years and knew exactly what normal looked like, went quiet for a long moment before answering. What he said next confirmed something Maggie had suspected for months, but hadn't let herself fully believe, that the timing of the trust and the timing of these withdrawals were not a coincidence at all. They were cause and effect. And Diane, still convinced she was the one building a case, had no idea the real file being assembled had her name at the top of it. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the funeral, in a conference room Robert Chen had used to settle Desmond's business affairs for 2 decades. Diane arrived 12 minutes early, dressed as though she expected an apology rather than a reckoning, certain the meeting had been called to finalize a settlement in her favor. Trevor sat beside her, checking his phone every few minutes, the truck dealership's most recent voicemail still unanswered. Robert let them wait a moment after they sat down before he opened the folder in front of him. A habit Desmond had once joked was the only theatrical instinct his old friend ever allowed himself. He started with the trust itself, laying a copy across the table and turning it to face Diane, rather than himself. He explained, in plain and unhurried language, that Desmond had transferred full ownership of the Ridgemont Lane property into an irrevocable trust 8 months before his death, naming Maggie as its sole beneficiary, with every signature notarized and every filing completed exactly as the law required. Diane read the date twice, as though rereading it might change it. "That's not possible," she said. "He would have told me." Robert didn't argue the point. He simply turned the page to the notarization stamp and let the paper answer for her. Diane's disbelief curdled fast into the same accusation she'd been rehearsing for weeks, that Robert had manipulated a dying man, that the trust would be challenged, that a judge would see it her way. Robert let her finish before answering. He reminded her that Desmond had passed 2 independent capacity evaluations that year, both requested by Desmond himself, both filed alongside the trust, precisely to prevent this exact argument. Desmond, it turned out, had anticipated this conversation almost a year before it happened. He hadn't just protected the house. He'd protected the paperwork that protected the house, closing every door Diane might have tried before she even knew to look for it. It was Trevor who asked the question that mattered more than he realized. "So what happens to the money we already put toward this?" he said, and Robert's expression changed for the first time that afternoon, not softer, but more deliberate, the look of a man moving toward the part of the conversation he'd been saving. He told them there was a second matter to discuss, one that had come to light during the trust dispute, and he opened a folder considerably thicker than the first. What came out of that folder was 18 months of Desmond's bank statements, organized by date, with recurring withdrawals highlighted in a hand Diane didn't recognize but would come to understand, belonged to Maggie. Robert read the figures aloud, evenly, without embellishment, because the numbers didn't need embellishment to land. $14,000 in June, authorized under a power of attorney Desmond had signed months earlier for medical emergencies only. $22,000 in September, routed through an account Trevor had opened for his failed venture. Smaller withdrawals nearly every month after that. Each one timed, Robert noted, to periods when Desmond's own medical records showed measurable cognitive decline. Diane's face moved through several expressions in the space of that reading. Irritation, then confusion, then something closer to calculation, as if she were trying to determine how much of this could still be explained away. She reached for the familiar defense that the money had gone toward household expenses Desmond had approved, that any husband would want his wife to have access to shared accounts. Robert asked, quietly, whether Desmond had approved the $22,000 that went directly into an account bearing Trevor's name. Neither of them answered that question, and the silence that followed did more damage than anything Robert could have said. He told them, still evenly, that this file was not a threat to be negotiated the way the trust dispute had been. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult carried its own reporting obligations, ones Robert was required to follow regardless of what Diane decided to do next. He hadn't filed anything with the state yet. He didn't explain why he was waiting, because the person who'd asked him to wait was sitting close enough to hear every word of it. Robert saved the letter for last, the way Desmond had asked him to. He unfolded a single handwritten page, and his voice, usually clipped and procedural, slowed as he read it aloud. Desmond had written it 8 months earlier, the same afternoon he signed the trust, in handwriting that had already begun to shake. He told Maggie he'd seen more than he ever let on, the withdrawals, the excuses, the slow draining of an account he'd spent 30 years building. He wrote that he was ashamed of how long it took him to act, and prouder than he could say of the daughter who never once asked him to choose between peace and the truth. The letter closed with a line Robert read twice, as if to make sure it landed the way Desmond intended. He told Maggie the house had always been hers, in every way that mattered, and that the paperwork was simply him finally making it official before someone else decided otherwise. He asked her not to feel guilty about whatever she chose to do with what he'd left behind, the house, the money, the truth about the withdrawals, because he'd rather she use all of it than protect people who had never once protected her. Trevor said nothing for the rest of the meeting. He'd come in worried about a truck deposit and was leaving with the understanding that his name was written into a financial exploitation file, an attorney was legally positioned to report at any time. Before Diane could gather herself to leave, Robert opened the door to the small side office and asked Maggie to come in. She had been waiting there since before the meeting started, close enough to hear every word, exactly as she and Robert had planned it. Diane looked at her stepdaughter standing calm and unhurried in the doorway and understood, in that instant, that she had never once been negotiating with an attorney. She had been negotiating with Maggie the entire time and simply hadn't known it. Maggie let the silence in that office stretch longer than she needed to. She'd waited months for this exact moment, watched Diane spend money on a house that was never hers, listened to Trevor accuse an innocent man of forgery, held her tongue through every small cruelty on that porch, not out of weakness, but because she understood something Diane never did. Real power doesn't announce itself. It waits for the other person to overextend, and then it simply lets the math catch up to them. When Maggie finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. the same way she hadn't raised it on the porch. She offered Diane a choice instead of a courtroom: leave the house, drop any further claim, and the financial records would stay a private matter between family and attorney. Fight it, and they wouldn't. Diane opened her mouth to argue, and found, for the first time in the entire ordeal, that she had nothing left to argue with. Every version of this conversation she'd rehearsed on the drive over assumed she'd be the one delivering terms, not receiving them. She looked at Robert, hoping for some technicality to cling to, and found only the same patient, unmoving expression he'd worn through the whole meeting. She looked at Trevor, who wouldn't meet her eyes. And she looked, finally, at Maggie, the stepdaughter she'd spent 20 years treating as an afterthought, and understood that the softest person in that room had also been the most dangerous one, and had been for months. Diane took 11 days to leave, longer than Maggie expected, though nothing about the departure resembled the triumphant exit Diane had once imagined for herself. Maggie drove past twice during that final week, not to gloat, but out of an old habit she couldn't quite break, checking on a house that had spent 2 decades feeling like it belonged to someone else. On the last evening, she watched Diane's car pull out of the driveway for the final time. No boxes visible through the windows, no ceremony to mark the moment. It was, Maggie thought, exactly the kind of quiet ending Diane had once denied her. Trevor's reckoning arrived on its own schedule, with none of the mercy Maggie had extended to his mother. The truck dealership repossessed the deposit vehicle within weeks, once the promised financing never materialized. His creditors, tired of vague reassurances about a house sale that no longer existed, began proceedings of their own. Nobody in the family stepped in to cover the difference this time, not because they couldn't, but because the one person who'd always quietly covered for him no longer had the money or the will to do it again. Diane left the house within the month, quietly, without the sale she'd already spent in her head. Trevor's debts caught up with him regardless, no windfall arriving to soften the landing. Maggie moved back into the home her father built board by board on a Sunday in early spring, carrying in the same boxes Diane had once forced her to pack in 48 hours. She found the porch swing still hanging where Desmond had left it, weathered but intact, and sat on it alone for a long time before bringing anything else inside. For the first time in 20 years, she walked through the house's rooms without feeling like a guest in her own life, without flinching at a rearranged photograph, without waiting for someone else's permission to belong there. She didn't renovate, she didn't sell, she simply lived there, the way her father always intended, in the house that had quietly belonged to her since 8 months before anyone thought to check. There was no dramatic confrontation to end this story, no raised voices or slammed doors, because Maggie had never needed one. She'd learned, watching her father live quietly for 20 years inside a marriage that slowly took more than it gave, that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one who wins it. Diane had spent months building a case, a sale, an entire imagined future on a foundation that had already been removed without her knowledge. And once she finally understood that, no courtroom victory could have humiliated her more than simply being right too late to matter. What this story leaves behind isn't really about a house. It's about what patience looks like when it's mistaken for weakness, and what happens when someone finally decides to stop proving a point out loud and start proving it on paper instead. Diane never once suspected that the calm, quiet woman she pushed off that porch had already read the ending before Diane had even finished writing the beginning. So the question worth sitting with is this: would you have confronted her on the porch that day, or would you have done exactly what Maggie did and let the silence do the damage instead? And that raises a harder question still. How many people are, right now, sitting on a truth like Maggie's, waiting, watching, letting someone else spend money and confidence on a victory that was never really theirs to claim? Tell us in the comments, would you have fought back on the porch or played the long game the way Maggie did? And if this story pulled you in, wait until you hear what happens in a story we're releasing next, about a woman who discovered her inheritance came with a debt nobody warned her about. If you're hooked on these twists, take a second to subscribe and drop a comment below. Let me know what you think or what you want to see next. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because in the end, every choice has a story, and every story leaves a lesson.